This week we have Mike Feist with us. He has been with us, he says, for 25 years now, about the same time I've been with the agency. And as a research scientist, conducting monitoring and assessment of Minnesota's water resources. He earned a fisheries degree from the University of Minnesota and says he received a summer internship while still in school conducting fish community surveys in the rivers and streams of Minnesota. And he finishes up his bio with, he didn't know then that biological monitoring and biocriteria development would turn into a career, but he says, quote, "Here I am over 25 years later, still slogging around in waters and shocking fish." Well, welcome to the club, Mike, and it's great to have you with us. This is a talk that I've been looking forward to for a while because this study that you're going to talk about today made the news last fall, I think. And so I thought it was going to be a great subject to hear about today. So why don't you tell us about it?
All right, thanks, Mark. Yeah, there was a report released in the fall, kind of summarizing at a high level the results of our monitoring and assessment of the St. Croix River. So Mark invited me to speak today about that. So let's get to it. This is a picture of Lake St. Croix, kind of down on the lower end of the lake somewhere. And hopefully you're all familiar with this pretty amazing resource that we have very nearby to the metropolitan area here. So today, not only am I going to talk about kind of the results of our study, but I'm also going to first start off with, the monitoring and how we conduct that monitoring, what goes into assessment of that monitoring data, and then we'll get into the results of what we found in the St. Croix River. Now here's a picture of the upper St. Croix. This is probably more up by, north of Pine City and near Danbury. It's a little bit more of a canoe river up there. So first, just a little primer on why we do the monitoring and what the objectives of that monitoring are. Much of what the PCA does in the water world is driven by the Clean Water Act. It's actually why many of us have jobs here at the agency. Significant functions or work of both the Environmental Outcomes Division and the Watershed Division within PCA are directly tied to Clean Water Act requirements. Staff in the water assessment section work on determining beneficial uses of water bodies and establishing standards to protect those uses. My section, the surface water monitoring section, comprises many staff working on monitoring and assessment or determining if waters of the state are meeting their uses. And many staff in the Watershed Division, work on identifying pollutant sources, reductions needed, and developing restoration and protection strategies. And when we think about developing a monitoring strategy, it's very important to think about what the objectives of that monitoring are. And here at the agency, and the primary goal of our monitoring is to evaluate use support of beneficial uses. And I'm talking about things like aquatic life use, aquatic recreation use, and aquatic consumption use. Also drinking water use if the water body is so designated. And typically waters that are designated are actually used for drinking water, and the St. Croix is a little bit unique in that it actually is protected as a drinking water source, even though there are no surface water intakes on the river. But rumor has it that back in the early 70s, when they were designating uses, because of its popularity as a canoeing river and recreation river, and the fact that there might be people drinking the water with little treatment, they actually protected the St. Croix for drinking water. So aquatic life use is really primarily to provide healthy aquatic communities. aquatic rec use is for, protection for swimming and wading and boating with minimal risk of illness or nuisance algae conditions. And aquatic consumption use is, so that fish and other organisms are safe to eat. And there are a fair amount of standards and rules to protect these beneficial uses. This is only a partial list here, but it includes many of the primary parameters of interest. So aquatic life use in streams, we're looking at things like fish and macroinvertebrates, but also water chemistry parameters like DO, ammonia, pH, TSS, chloride, pesticides, metals, and our river eutrophication standards. In lakes, we use fish IBI and chloride. And aquatic rec, in streams, really the parameter of interest is E. coli. Lakes, there's a nutrient standard as well, but it's in lakes, we look at phosphorus and chlorophyll as a rec standard, where in streams, that river eutrophication is an aquatic life use. And then the aquatic consumption use, we're looking at things like mercury and PCBs in fish tissue, and also PFAS. And drinking water use, of course, nitrogen is the primary parameter of interest for evaluating that use. So hopefully, as many of you probably know, in conjunction with passing of the Clean Water Land and Legacy Amendment in 2008, the PCA rolled out the watershed approach, a much more comprehensive and coordinated structure around water quality management. And the goal is to manage water quality through a 10-year cycle via the major watersheds. And it was set up to integrate biological, chemical, and physical monitoring in a systematic, sampling in a systematic way at different watershed scales. And the graphic to the right here is kind of depicting, how within a major watershed, we will monitor at different scales within that watershed. And really, this was, designed to collect a lot more data, more comprehensive data, and integrate the agency data collection efforts along with citizen and local monitoring through things like the SWAG grant process, and now in cycle 2, the state and local needs monitoring process. And we're interested in collecting data for, most of our indicators so that we can assess waters for their various beneficial uses, aquatic life, aquatic rec, aquatic consumption, so forth. And, this approach was designed to really give us a more comprehensive and complete assessment picture of our surface waters compared to, historically kind of more scattershot approach to monitoring and assessment. And it would allow us to more readily identify impairments and waters also in need of protection. So not focusing just on identifying, impaired waters, but also those in need of protection. And it would better allow us to identify stressors and sources of those impairments, and so that we could develop more comprehensive watershed plans and track trends and evaluate effectiveness in subsequent cycles, because we're planning on returning to these major watersheds, on a once every 10-year basis. And there's about 80 major watersheds in Minnesota, and we're monitoring, 6 to 8 of those a year. But the watershed approach didn't address large rivers in Minnesota. And large rivers, these are systems that encompass multiple major watersheds. And so we needed a strategy to complement the watershed approach, and we did develop one for large rivers. And so when I talk about large rivers in Minnesota, I'm talking about the St. Croix, the Mississippi, the Minnesota, the Red, and Rainy rivers. The lower Mississippi obviously is a large river. Well, it's a great river, what we call a great river. In fact, it's, you know, we've got that navigational pool system. And our large river monitoring strategy doesn't include the lower Miss. We're sort of currently working on a multi-state interagency approach to monitoring and assessment of the lower Mississippi. It's kind of it's a little bit different animal. So, you know, I'm not talking about, or the large river monitoring doesn't include the lower Mississippi, but we're working on that. Anyway, so to complement the watershed approach, we, you know, developed a large river strategy that was also systematic in nature and contained different aspects of monitoring as we were at different scales as well. So the large river monitoring, we're scaling the types of data that we collect based on the HUC 8, 10, and 12 scale. And this graphic to the right here illustrates that, you know, this is the St. Croix Basin, and then each of these colors is a different HUC 10 scale, and then the HUC 12s are within that. So, and the scale determines the level of monitoring that we will do at each site. I'll get into that a little bit more later. And in conjunction with our monitoring strategy, we also consolidated our assessment reaches along the major rivers. And for those of you that don't know, we have WIDs or AUIDs, and that is the scale that we assess our water bodies at. And historically, that WID delineation process has kind of been a little bit arbitrary. It's been trib to trib. And so on these large rivers, we often had a lot of WIDs, and, you know, they could range anywhere from like 0.1 mile in length to 60 miles in length. And for the St. Croix, for example, used to had 22 different WIDs. And so it's really hard to sort of monitor and assess all of our water bodies when things are sort of arbitrarily, you know, divvied up. And so in conjunction with the monitoring strategy, we also consolidated our WIDs to conform to the HUC 10 scale. So we went from 22 different WIDs on the St. Croix to 5. And that way we can sort of coalesce our monitoring and assessment around that scale of river. And the first round of data for the St. Croix was collected in 2017. And when we go into a large river, we're looking at monitoring over 2 years. So in the St. Croix, we monitored in 2017 and 2008 over the summer timeframe. And large rivers, just like the watershed approach, you know, the plan is to monitor these on a 10-year cycle. So we will return to the St. Croix likely in 2027. So I mentioned that the types of data that we collect are different depending on the scale. At the HUC 12, that sort of smallest scale watershed, we are monitoring for fish and inverts. So we will collect samples of the fish community and the invertebrate community. And along with that, we also do one-time, you know, field water chemistry as well as lab samples for phosphorus and TSS and ammonia. And as we get to the next larger scale, the HUC 10 scale, we'll do the biological sampling, but also much more intensive water chemistry sampling at those sites. And over the course of 2 years, they'll be monitoring, twice a month from the May through September time period. And that's so that we can collect enough data to be able to assess for those indicators. And we're also collecting E. coli for aquatic recreation use at those sites. And again, that's, over the course of 2 years, and we collect data 3 times a month, June through August. That's kind of the time frame that we're interested in E. coli data for aquatic recreation. And then we're also collecting nitrogen data for, to assess for our drinking water standards. And then at the Huck 8 scale, which is the major watershed scale, we do everything that we do at the other sites, so biology and the more intensive water chemistry, but we'll also collect fish for fish tissue analysis and contaminants like mercury and PCBs. And that's so that we can assess for aquatic consumption. And the St. Croix, again, is a little bit unique in that the lowest portion of that river is actually a natural lake known as Lake St. Croix. And we actually monitor and assess it as a lake. So it has different standards. And so we collect different types of data so that we can monitor and assess it as a lake. Now I wanted to give you all just a little high-level overview of our assessment process now, so that, now that we have all this data collected, what do we do with it and how do we use it? So we conduct assessments on an annual basis based on, what watersheds, or in this case, large river, are up for assessment. And this process kind of happens over a 4 or 5 month timeline. It begins in the fall with data collection and processing of that data, and a call for data that goes out, and then a desktop review, watershed assessment, team meetings, professional judgment group meetings, public comment, and then finally a list submitted to EPA. And I'll break down these steps a little bit, spend a little bit of time on each of these. So delayed data collection and processing. A call for data is issued in advance of our assessment round, and they're looking for data within a 10-year window. So any data within the previous 10 years, we put out there for folks to submit any data that they have and want to be used for assessment. So it's not just the data that we collect that goes into the assessment process. There's, a lot of other folks out there that are collecting data, and the agency solicits that data, asks for that data to be used in the assessment process for the preceding 10 years. So once that data is finalized, it goes into, used to be STORAT, now EQUIS, and it's gathered from external sources, places like the EPA, other state agencies, tribal partners, all of our local monitoring partners, Met Council. Oftentimes there's a significant amount of data out there available, and obviously a resource like the St. Croix, there is a lot of data. So all that data is loaded, summarized, and compared to standards in what we call the Wallace data system. The next step is desktop review. And so this is an individual parameter by parameter review done by the subject matter experts for that. The invert and fish biologists review biological data, and water quality data is reviewed by lake and stream staff, amongst others, depending on the parameter. The data is reviewed independently, and the end result is a determination of whether or not each parameter meets or exceeds the applicable standard. So is dissolved oxygen meeting its standard? Phosphorus, fish, inverts, all the individual parameters. Are they meeting or exceeding the standards associated with that parameter? That happens at the desktop review stage. The next stage is the watershed assessment team meeting. And this is a meeting of internal PCA staff, the biologist, the chemist, our stressor ID folks, project managers for the watersheds or large rivers, and others get together to determine if the beneficial use is supporting. These are preliminary judgments of use support made for each of the various uses, if there's available data and if the use is, appropriate for that water body. So we have a preliminary judgment, and then we will take that judgment to what we call the professional judgment group. Now, this is a much larger meeting of not only the WAT folks, but also all of our external stakeholders that are interested in this particular, large river in the case of the St. Croix, or watershed if we're assessing a watershed. So this is all your local resource managers, anyone that, submitted and provided data, where we meet to discuss and finalize these assessment decisions. Prior to that meeting, we will send out a list of all the water bodies, comments, and preliminary, assessment decisions for them to review. And then at the meeting, we'll get together and we'll discuss any of these new impairments or other reaches of interest from the local parties. Next, it'll go to a public comment period. So we will send out the new draft of impaired waters for formal public comment. And in some cases, we get written comments back about our assessment decisions, and we will review and respond to those comments. And so for the St. Croix, the public comment period was the fall of 2019, and the impaired waters list is actually still pending submittal to EPA. Seems like these things are always delayed, but this one, I think, even more so than most years, and wild rice is kind of still hanging us up. So that list has actually not been submitted to EPA yet, formally. All right, so enough of that. Let's start getting into the assessment of the St. Croix River. So our monitoring, our large river monitoring, we collected data at 17 sites in 2017 and 2018. There's also 2 watershed pollutant load monitoring sites on the main stem that are sampled annually. The call for external data was made in September 2018, and I mentioned that there was a lot of data, and there was 74 stations that contained water chemistry data within that 10-year window. A lot of data we got from the National Park Service, the USGS, Met Council has a ton of data, and as well as Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources. So it was, in addition to the data that we collect, we, as I mentioned, solicit for any data within that 10-year window. And in the case of the St. Croix, there was an awful lot of data that was used for assessment. We completed assessments in early 2019, met with the professional judgment group stakeholders in June of 2019. Public comment was fall of 2019. And as I mentioned, the list is still pending formal submittal. So, of course, I have to start with some fish data collected as part of our monitoring effort on the St. Croix. We collected fish at 13 stations. I mentioned the 17, that's because the lake was 4 stations, and we don't use, our fish river IBIs on the lake. So we collected fish at 13 stations. We sampled 63 different species at those 13 sites, 30 of which were sensitive to pollution, and 4 species were of special concern. These are species that are unique and have highly specialized habitat requirements and really deserve careful monitoring status. And these 4 are the crystal darter, top left there, top right gilt darter, blue sucker, bottom left, and lake sturgeon. Those are all special concern species in Minnesota. And actually the crystal darter is considered endangered, which is even a higher level of protection. So we use the Index of Biological Integrity, or the IBI, to evaluate aquatic life condition. In a nutshell, the IBI is a tool for quantifying biological community data into a score on a 0 to 100 scale. It gives us a numeric representation of biological condition. And this numeric score is compared to a threshold to determine whether a stream is supporting of its aquatic life use. An IBI is a synthesis of multiple representative metrics that reflect the overall integrity of the community. And as you can see by the graph here, the health of the fish community, or the health of the stream as measured by the fish community, is excellent. The St. Croix is an excellent indication of what fish communities should look like. And the invertebrate data as well scored very good. So the St. Croix passes with flying colors for aquatic life use, using fish and inverts as a measure of that. And I'd also like to mention that the graph here illustrates just the data that was collected as part of our recent monitoring effort. But our program, has data going back to the mid-90s, and we've actually got, 56 visits across 33 different stations that corroborate this finding. So we've got quite a bit of biological data that indicates the St. Croix is doing pretty darn well at the biological level.
Hey, Mike.
Yeah.
We've got a question in the chat. I don't know if you want to take questions as you go or save them for the end.
We can take questions now. That's fine.
Marco was just wondering if you sample mussels.
We do not sample mussels, no. DNR does mussel sampling. It's not in conjunction with, evaluating use support, but the PCA itself does not, sample or monitor mussels for, determining aquatic life use. Any others?
Nope, that's it for now.
Okay, thanks, because I can't see the chat.
Right, yep. I'll let you know if we have any more.
Okay. All right, so this busy graphic here is just to convey, for the different beneficial uses like aquatic life, aquatic rec, aquatic consumption, and drinking water. There's a lot of different parameters and a lot of different standards, and these are the parameters that we made, parameter judgments of whether or not standards were, meeting or exceeding. And, meets MTS, that means that parameter, the data that we have available for that parameter is meeting. It's supporting, in this case, aquatic life use for IBI fish or IBI inverts. EXS is it exceeds. So when you look at this, big ugly table, you only see that for all of this data and all of these parameters that we had, the only indication where we tripped standards were for phosphorus, which is the causative variable, and chlorophyll A is the response variable for our river nutrient standards. And in the lake, phosphorus is an aquatic rec use, and it tripped the standard in Lake St. Croix, the bottom row there. So in the vast majority of cases, we had a lot of data, and all the parameters passed where you see meets. Now you also see a lot of IFs, and IF means insufficient. And what that typically means is that there just isn't enough data available for that parameter to be able to say it's meeting or exceeding. But I can tell you in the case of the St. Croix, any of those places where you see IF, the data that we did have was supporting. It didn't trip the standards. So for the metals, we had limited amounts of data, but no standard was exceeded. We also have IF for DO. We actually have a lot of DO information available, but the way the standard is written, you can't say it's meeting unless you have at least 20 pre-9 a.m. measurements. And we didn't have at least 20 pre-9 a.m. measurements for DO, so they have to say insufficient. But the DO data that we do have is not tripping the standard. So I just wanted to show you this to kind of give you an indication of, all the different parameters that were looked at in terms of the St. Croix and what goes into an, aquatic life or aquatic rec, and so forth parameters. But things are looking pretty good in the St. Croix, with the exception of tripping some of those nutrient standards. And this is just a little graphic from our report, kind of breaks down the overall, findings of what we found in terms of whether or not the various uses are being supported. And, this probably doesn't look as good as, maybe you thought with the red X's, but, all those red X's for the most part are in that aquatic consumption use. And those are all legacy impairments for mercury and PCBs. All of our large rivers are really impaired for aquatic consumption use. Unfortunately, there's, and these are tied to whether or not there's a fish consumption advisory, on that water body. So, these, I think mercury was listed in 1998, I think, and PCBs in 2006. So unfortunately, these are just sort of long-standing legacy impairments that are pretty common. It's not to say that you can't eat anything from the river. I don't know what the consumption advisories are for the St. Croix off the top of my head. Probably 2 meals per month or something like that. But anyway, the data, the more recent data that we collected, everything is supporting for aquatic rec and aquatic life until you get to that lower reach of the St. Croix River and Lake St. Croix itself, where we start tripping some of those nutrient standards. And just here's some longitudinal average phosphorus concentrations of the St. Croix River, where you can see that, and this moves from upstream on the left to downstream on the right, where concentrations of phosphorus are increasing in the river as we move downstream. It's probably not that surprising, when you consider the land cover in the St. Croix Basin. A lot of the upper watershed is still, pretty intact and protected with forests and wetlands and that sort of thing. And as you move downstream, there's more development that it's occurring. So, and the river kind of illustrates that. Moving downstream, we're starting to see some cumulative effects of that land use. These are just graphics from the pollutant load monitoring network, which corroborates that, in that, you know, for sediment and nitrogen, the St. Croix and St. Croix Basin is, you know, looking pretty darn good. And, you know, we start to see some phosphorus issues in the St. Croix. And you, looking at that statewide map, you can kind of also see that, you know, the northern part of the state where things are less developed and more intact, you know, levels are low. And as you move south and west, a lot more ag development and so forth, you see a lot higher concentrations. And the St. Croix isn't bad. It's just not as good as it could be in terms of phosphorus. There's also, I mentioned earlier, Met Council just has, you know, a wealth of data over a long period of time on a couple of stations on the lower St. Croix, more in the metropolitan area. And, you know, they have data pretty much over a 40-year window of time, and they've shown that concentrations of sediment, bacteria, and phosphorus have actually decreased in that time frame. While nitrogen and chloride, you know, while concentrations are low, it is showing an increasing trend. So that's something that we need to be cognizant of in terms of protection strategies for the St. Croix. As you know, they are low concentrations, they're not tripping standards, but you know, they are increasing. And the lower the Lake St. Croix was actually listed as impaired originally in 2008 for eutrophication. And the good news is that local and regional partners have been working for several years now to decrease phosphorus levels, and it appears with some success. So kind of the major takeaways that I have for the St. Croix is that, you know, the river really is a national treasure and is one of the few North American rivers of its size to have a relatively intact ecosystem and biological community. Much of the river fully supports standards designed to protect aquatic life and recreation. And, you know, located near a major metropolitan area, the St. Croix, you know, offers exceptional recreation for hundreds of thousands of people. But that attraction, you know, also poses some threats. Development from urban and ag uses means more runoff, which of course more runoff means more pollutants. And as the landscape becomes more developed in the lower reaches, more phosphorus comes into the river from runoff and wastewater discharges, and nitrogen and chloride are low, but increasing. So there are threats to this resource. And protection strategies will be crucial to continue to preserve this valuable resource, maintaining wetlands and forests and other conditions that foster a healthy water quality will ensure its resiliency to threats from changing land use and climate. I mentioned that the PCA released a report in the fall of 2020, and that report was released in conjunction with the St. Croix River Association report that the state of the St. Croix River, and these were kind of deliberately timed to be released together to celebrate the anniversary, the October anniversary of the landmark wild and scenic river legislation that in 1968 established the St. Croix National Scenic Riverway, and it was one of the nation's first wild and scenic rivers. And you can find these reports linked on our website. Marco mentioned mussels. We don't monitor and assess mussels, but the St. Croix River watershed is the premier mussel watershed of the upper Mississippi River, and actually one of the premier mussel watersheds in the world. There's 41 mussel species that live in the St. Croix River. And of these 41, Wisconsin and Minnesota have listed 15 and 20 as state endangered or state threatened. And 5 species of mussels that occur in the river are also listed as federally endangered. And it's thought that the St. Croix actually still contains its pre-European mussel community, that no species have been extirpated. This is, I mean, that's a pretty significant, the fact that mussels in the St. Croix are so diverse and still in existence is, you know, pretty incredible for a large river, actually. These species are disappearing and have disappeared at a pretty rapid rate in a lot of our large rivers. So this is an excellent indicator of, you know, the biological health of the St. Croix. It really is kind of a special place. And of all the rivers and streams that I've had, you know, been fortunate enough to sample, the St. Croix is my favorite in the state. And if you haven't had a chance to experience it or recreate on it, I highly recommend it. And that could be anything from pleasure boating on the lower St. Croix to more, you know, wilderness experience on the upper St. Croix. There's a lot of, you know, canoe camping and that sort of thing, where you're not going to see a lot of people. And the fact that it's wild and scenic, you know, is really limited to development along its shorelines. And so you can really get a pretty, you know, wilderness experience on the St. Croix. So highly encourage it. I leave you with, of course, a fish picture. This is a lake sturgeon. It was caught in the St. Croix, kind of near Stillwater. And it was caught almost 2 years ago today, 2 years ago, February. And it's the new state record. Catch and release lake sturgeon. This thing was 78 inches long. So pretty impressive. That's all I got. Questions? Thank you.
All right, well, thank you, Mike. We do have a few questions. Well, it's more of a conversation, I think. So I don't know if, Catherine, you want to just unmute and raise your kind of discussion item with Mike? Or if you want me to.
Sure. No, here
Okay.
I am, Brooke. Thank you. Yeah, Mike, I'm glad you included this information on the mussels, and I'm in the water quality standards unit, and I'm just aware that mussels are a very sensitive species, and studies on, you know, how pollutants like nitrate and ammonia affect the mussel population are, you know, have been done and are perhaps key studies that will impact future revisions of those standards. And so I just wondered, I mean, I understand that that's a kind of a specialty area, but do we, or are we considering how to incorporate DNR's work with mussels into our biological assessments of rivers?
Not really. I mean, I think we have, you know, fish and inverts communities that we utilize as indicators. As you mentioned, of course, you know, mussels are incredibly sensitive and, you know, very valuable indicator in their own right. But I'm not aware of anyone at our agency that is, you know, looking at developing a similar sort of, you know, standard or tool to be used, you know, looking at mussel data.
Yeah.
It's a good thought, but
Well, it seems like maybe you could rope it in. It certainly you wouldn't want
Yeah.
to develop the aquatic life, the tailor or anything like that. But
Yeah, I mean, when you talk about standards and rule, it gets a little complicated. We have actually, referenced the mussel communities when we assessed the Minnesota River, and sort of referenced the loss of mussels in that river as being kind of an indication that the river is degraded. But in terms of listing something, we don't really have the tools and the standards to do that at this point. It's certainly something that hopefully could be developed and looked at in the future, but there's not any ongoing efforts at this point that I'm aware of.
thank you, Mike, for
Mm-hmm.
the presentation.
Do we have any other questions out there? Oh, it looks like Morgan had a question about PJGs. I think he said to ignore his question. He said he had a question and then, or she, I guess, yeah, ignore my question. So I think we can ignore that PJG question. Mike, you must have answered it after they asked it. The locks and dams that prevent fish movement down the Mississippi also affect mussel reproduction in the St. Croix. Earlier in the presentation, you mentioned wild rice being an issue with submitting the report. Could you speak more to that?
Yeah, I don't know, all the details of that. I just know that, the continuing issue around wild rice and the wild rice standard, and whether or not we should be assessing for wild rice and using, and how we would assess is sort of holding up the formal submittal of our list to EPA because, as many of you probably know, we've been trying to, develop new standards that have been going round and round and, lawsuits and everything else. And nothing's been finalized in that regard. So that wild rice issue is still holding up the submittal of our list to EPA. I don't know if there's anyone else out there. I don't know if Miranda's on this call or anybody that can speak to it a little bit better than I can.
Sure, it appears I can unmute myself. Hi, everybody. I'm Miranda Nichols. I work in the Water Quality Standards Unit. And the blurb about wild rice is we have a very old 10 milligrams per liter sulfate standard to protect wild rice. It's been on the books since the 70s. We've never really enforced it. Tribes and environmental groups are upset with us. And that's worked its way on the impaired waters list because we don't have any impairments for sulfate in wild rice waters. And they're thrown into that. The state legislature in 2018 actually has passed a session law that says we cannot, the PCA cannot enforce, list, assess for the 10 milligram per liter standard. So even though that's, well, in clear violation of the Clean Water Act, let's be honest, it's still state law. And so what Mike doesn't know, but if you read the chat, the impaired waters list was submitted this morning, like 2 hours ago. And our current stance is because of that session law, we still can't do anything, which is super unsatisfying. But it continues to play itself out and potentially future lawsuits. And that's the blurb on sulfate, the short version.
Thanks, Miranda.
All right, so I don't know, Mike, if now that you're not sharing your screen anymore, you can see the chat. There's a little bit of conversation more, it seems like, in there. So I don't know if you want to jump in on any of that. Someone's excited about finding crystal darters, and wants to know if you can disclose which WID they were found.
Yeah, they were, I think we found 2, and they were in the lower St. Croix. So above Lake St. Croix, but below Taylor's Falls. One or two of those sites. I don't recall off the top of my head exactly where, but lower St. Croix.
All right, awesome. Are there any other questions for Mike or comments? You guys can, of course, just unmute yourselves too. All right. Well, seems like we don't have any additional questions for you, Mike. So I just want to thank you for being with us, sharing your work. And this is really great to have this opportunity to learn from all of my great coworkers out there, all the work you guys are doing. So this is great. I'm glad that you took some time out of your day to share this with us. And our next seminar is March 11th, and we will have Bruce Munson with us, and we'll be talking about mercury in fish. So another fish seminar coming up here in March. So hopefully you guys will all join us for that talk. If otherwise, I'll just talk to everyone later. And thanks again, Mike, for being here with us and giving us a great presentation today.
Yeah, Mike, thanks a lot for the talk. That was great. It was sure interesting to find out more about the St. Croix River, and I thought you did a great job in telling us about it.
Thank you. Thanks for having me, and get out there and visit the St. Croix River if you haven't done so already. It really,
Yeah, I can say that if people have not canoe camped on the St. Croix, they're really missing a great experience and resource in their backyard.
Yep. And let's protect it.
Thanks, Mike.
All right, thank you.